Some of the scariest people to have ever lived have the most disturbing backstories. Whether their reasons for committing their horrific crimes was love, insanity, or no reason at all, these are definitely people you do not want to meet. Number 5. Eerie photos of a grinning man in a brick cell became even more disturbing, knowing this was the scary individual responsible for taking the lives of 3 women and terrorizing the streets of Melbourne. Eddie Leonski became known as the Brownout Strangler, targeting women on the streets of Melbourne when lighting was kept to a minimum in World War II. The country was already in a state of unease. There had been air attacks from Japan, and now 3% of the population was made up of American soldiers. Then the attacks began. Leonski was sent to Melbourne in early 1942 and was stationed at Camp Pell. He had a disturbing backstory before he entered the military. Mental health and alcohol problems ran in his family, and he was particularly close to his mother, who had been confined to an asylum for a time. He looked like he would be making something of his life despite a poor upbringing, but then he was drafted into the army. Just weeks after he arrived in Australia, he started to attack women in the manner that his disturbing nickname suggested. But he would always be interrupted before he could take his victims' lives, and flee the scene before he could be apprehended. This went on for a few months before Leonski went AWOL. Leonski was the camp cook, which gave him plenty of time to indulge in alcohol. When under the influence, he would perform acrobatics to entertain his fellow drinkers, but also became very violent. It was after spending hours drinking that he performed his crimes. In late March, he went AWOL on a 6-day drinking spree. It wasn't the first time he'd been absent without leave, but this time he ended up in jail for a month. Almost as soon as he was released, he started stalking and attacking women again, and on May 3rd, he would take his first life. His first victim was Ivy Violet McLeod. Ivy was 40 years old and had recently separated from her husband. Leonski found her waiting for a tram in Albert Park in the early hours of the morning. He violently took her life and disposed of her body before fleeing the scene. A week later, Leonski took a second life. Pauline Thompson was a 31-year-old singer and the wife of a police officer. She had come to Melbourne to perform for the troops. Leonski met Pauline in a bar and they drank together for a while before he offered to walk her home. When they were walking, she began to sing. When she stopped, Leonski attacked. He would later claim to have taken Pauline's life to get her voice. Leonski would confess his crimes to friends in the army, but they didn't believe him. The news of the true crimes was in the news, but they couldn't see Leonski as the criminal behind them. It was only after his third victim that the confessions would be taken seriously. Gladys Hosking worked at the chemistry library at Melbourne University. It's not clear how she met Leonski, but he would leave her body in a patch of yellow mud just outside of camp. It was the same mud that Leonski had returned to his tent covered in. He hadn't even bothered to clean himself up before collapsing in bed. Leonski was arrested. He confessed to the crimes and was found to be sane and guilty. He was given capital punishment. Despite terrorizing the women of Melbourne for months, his crimes and creepy nature faded into obscurity as the rest of the wartime horrors took over. Number 4. John George Hay was not the sort of individual you would want to run into if you had any kind of wealth. Hay had grown up comfortably middle class, but his need for more money had sent him on a path of crime, and eventually led to him becoming a scary person who committed some truly disgusting crimes. He started out as a con artist and a fraudster. It didn't take him long to be caught, and he was sentenced to prison. His family disowned him, and after being released, he moved to London to try to start again there. He took a job as a chauffeur, but continued to try to get money out of people through fraud. He pretended to be a solicitor and sold fake shares in estates of clients he claimed had passed away. Again, he was caught, and this time because he misspelled his fake name on legal documents. While in prison for the second time, he decided to escalate his crimes when he was released. This time, he couldn't leave any witnesses. On release, he got an accounting job at an engineering firm and ran into a man named William McSwan. William had been one of Hayes' clients when he was a chauffeur. He was now working as a landlord for the property his parents owned. Hay became jealous of his lifestyle and decided William would be his first victim. He lured his old friend to a basement that he rented and hit him over the head. Once William was no longer alive, he placed the body in a drum of chemicals until all that remained was sludge. The crime worked perfectly. He told William's parents he had run away to avoid the draft, and even took over William's role as landlord. When the draft was over and William's parents became suspicious, he took their lives too, disposing of their bodies in the same way he had William's. Hayes stole thousands of pounds and the property portfolio of the Williams family, but squandered the money on gambling and fine clothes. He needed to find a new source of income. His next victims would be the Hendersons. They were a wealthy couple who Hay met pretending to be interested in a property they were renting. He lured them to the same basement, took their lives, and disposed of their bodies with his signature method. He sold all of their possessions except their car and their dog, and continued to live his extravagant lifestyle. It was only a stupid mistake that led to Hayes' crimes being caught. His sixth victim was a woman named Olive Durand Deacon, who lived at the same hotel as Hay. He was able to lure him to a warehouse he was renting, as she wanted to show him an artificial fingernail invention that she had created. Hay cut Olive's life short and put her body in a drum of chemicals. The problem was, this time he was working in a new warehouse. The old location had a manhole where he could pour the remains down, but this time there was no access to the sewers. He left the drum in a pile of rubble behind the warehouse. Olive's friends reported her missing 2 days later, and it didn't take long for police to trace her to Hay. When they went to the warehouse, they found what remained of her body. Hay tried to plead insanity, but the jury didn't buy his story, and he was found guilty of his sinister crimes. Number 3. Whether or not Albert DeSalvo was actually the criminal that would be called the Boston Strangler is still debated, but he was definitely a scary individual. In the 1960s, a string of attacks on women of various ages and races had left Boston gripped in fear, and the police force were at a loss as to what to do. The crimes had a number of differences, not just in the victims' profiles, but to what the criminal responsible for their passings did with their bodies after the crime. But there were also enough similarities to convince law enforcement that the same person had taken the lives of 13 different women. Warnings were issued for women in the area not to let strangers in, and leave was canceled for police officers so they could try to get to the bottom of the crimes. But it was only when DeSalvo confessed that anyone was actually arrested for the string of attacks. DeSalvo was already known to police. He had a history of breaking and entering, but that would escalate to attacking the women who he robbed. They were left alive but traumatized by their encounters. One of these women was able to give a description to police, and DeSalvo was soon caught. It was then that he confessed to being the Boston Strangler. He had a photographic memory and was able to list countless details about the victims, including what their homes looked like, and even what they were wearing at the time of the attack. The strange thing was, lots of people didn't believe he was actually the person responsible, and DNA evidence from the last victim couldn't be matched to DeSalvo. He was convicted of the attacks on women who were left alive, and was attacked in prison while serving his sentence. The attack took place hours after he'd called his doctor to say he had something important to say about the Boston Strangler. DeSalvo would succumb to the wounds, and what the final piece of information that he wanted to pass on was has never been revealed. One possibility is that he wasn't the person responsible, but knew who was. One of the first people who confessed to being the Boston Strangler was another person in prison, George Nassar. Nassar is also one of the people suspected of being the infamous criminal, so it could have been that Nassar supplied DeSalvo with the details that he needed to describe the crime scenes to police. It's likely we may never know the truth about DeSalvo and the Boston Strangler, but these are both definitely scary individuals. Number 2. Gordon Frederick Cummins was a promising air cadet with a dark secret. He was also responsible for the most horrific string of attacks London had seen since Jack the Ripper. The awful nature of his crimes earned him the nickname the Blackout Ripper. Another wartime criminal, he attacked women on the streets of London over a 6-day period at the height of the Second World War. What triggered Cummins' crimes is a mystery. He was well liked among the other air cadets he was training with in the winter of 1942. They thought him a little pretentious as he claimed to be the illegitimate son of an aristocrat, but other than that, he seemed perfectly ordinary and was enthusiastic about becoming an airman. But when he wasn't on duty, he was searching London streets for victims. His first victim was 41-year-old Evelyn Hamilton. Evelyn had only intended to be staying in London for a night as she was traveling for a new job. It was sheer bad luck that one night was the night that Cummins decided to act on his twisted urges. He took her life in an air raid shelter and left her there for an electrician to find the following morning. His next 2 victims were both street workers whose lives were taken on consecutive days. Evelyn Oatley and Margaret Lowe both had their lives taken in their own beds after bringing Cummins home to spend the night. Their bodies had been left in truly horrific states, and word of the crimes now spread quickly through London's streetworker community. On Thursday, February 12th, just 3 days after the passing of Evelyn Hamilton, Cummins attacked 3 different women. The first was Mary Haywood, who wasn't a working girl but was actually at a restaurant waiting for her husband when Cummins approached her. He offered her $30. She refused but did accompany him out of the restaurant where he started to attack her. Mary struggled, attracting the attention of passers-by. Cummins fled the scene, leaving his military-issued gas mask behind. After this encounter, he hired Catherine Mulcahy. Catherine accompanied Cummins to bed but didn't remove her boots. He tried to take her life, and Mulcahy was able to kick him away and alerted the neighbors. Cummins again fled the scene. Finally, Cummins met Doris Juanette, who took him home. This time, he was able to achieve his evil deed and took Doris's life. But by now, Cummins' identity was already clear to authorities. Mary and Catherine both went to police, and the gas mask that he had dropped was able to be linked directly to Cummins. There was other evidence like fingerprints, mortar dust, and items belonging to his victims found in his possession. Cummins continued to claim he was innocent even after being found guilty, and never revealed what made him snap and commit such horrible acts. Number 1. Nancy Hazel would get a lot of names over the years. This was mostly due to the fact that she was married 5 times, taking her husband's surname on each occasion. But the name she would be known as in the media was the Giggling Granny, due to her unsettling habit of laughing as she told the story of how she took the lives of 4 of her 5 husbands. Nancy was Nancy Doss when her crimes were finally uncovered in 1954. She had married Samuel Doss the year before. He was a good man, especially compared to some of her other husbands, who suffered a lengthy stay in the hospital with flu-like symptoms. After he was released from the hospital, he returned home to be with the woman he loved, only to pass away shortly after. An autopsy revealed a large amount of poison in his body. Doss had tried to take his life with poison-laced cake. When he recovered from that, she'd put poison in his coffee. Doss was arrested, and she confessed to taking the lives of 3 other men. Her first husband managed to escape the marriage alive. They'd been married for 7 years before the relationship broke down, and he eventually left her. She then met Frank Harrelson through a Lonely Hearts column. Doss had been obsessed with romance magazines since she was a teenager, and dreamed of finding her true love like the stories in the magazines. It was this that she blamed for her crimes. After marrying Frank, she realized that he wasn't the one. They stayed together for 16 years, even though he was abusive, before Doss spiked his moonshine. It was assumed Frank passed away due to food poisoning. Free of her husband, Doss returned to the Lonely Hearts ads. It was here that she met Arlie Lanning, husband number 3. Arlie lasted until 1952 before Doss put poison in his food and he suffered a heart attack. He was a heavy drinker, and this was blamed for the sudden attack that claimed his life. Husband number 4 was a womanizer named Richard Morton. Richard was far from faithful to Doss, but he wasn't often at home to notice. She was caring for her mother, who had broken her hip. Doss's father had passed away, so it was up to her to care for her mother. Strangely, Doss's mother and sister both passed away not long after she arrived. After taking care of her mother, Doss decided to end her relationship with her husband the same way that she had her other husbands. He passed away under mysterious circumstances in May of 1953. When Doss was eventually caught, she laughed about her crimes. She claimed she had done it because the romance magazines had had a profound impact on her mind after she suffered a head injury as a child. It was suspected that Doss was responsible for numerous other true crimes, and the passing of a number of other relatives and in-laws, including her mother and sister. But she only confessed to taking the lives of her husbands. This scary individual's life ended in prison, where she was serving a life sentence. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.